Have you ever prayed for months, for years, and felt nothing back? Have you ever wondered if God was there at all when the silence became so heavy you could barely breathe? Have you ever asked yourself what happens when faith is tested not by tragedy, not by persecution, but by the most terrifying thing of all, absolute emptiness? In 1535, a 20-year-old woman named Teresa Sanchez de Cepeda y Ahumada ran away from her father's house in Avila, Spain. She entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation on November 2nd. She did not go because she felt called. She went because she was terrified of hell. She went because it seemed like the safest path. She took her vows. She became Sister Teresa of Jesus, and then she waited for God to meet her there. He did not come. If you value documented Catholic history like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you are hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the life of Saint Teresa of Avila. A biography published by Princeton University Press, detailed academic analysis from the journal Études littéraires at Université Laval examining Teresa's mystical poetry and spiritual darkness, and the exhaustively documented Come Be My Light, the private. Writings of the Saint of Calcutta, edited by Brian Kolodiechuk, which provides parallel experiences of spiritual darkness in another canonized saint. These are not popular summaries. These are primary biographical sources and peer-reviewed academic studies that reveal what the saints actually experienced behind the legend. Now back to the information. Within 2 years of entering the convent, Teresa's body began to fail. In autumn of 1538, her health collapsed. She went to stay with her half-sister Maria de Cepeda de Barrientos at Castellanos de la Cañada. On the way, she stopped at Hortigosa to visit her uncle, Don Pedro de Cepeda. He gave her a book, The Third Spiritual Alphabet by Francisco de Osuna, a guide to contemplative prayer, a manual on interior silence and spiritual concentration. She read it. She tried to practice what it taught. In April of 1539, she went to Besides for medical treatment. The treatments did not work. On August 15th, 1539, she suffered an attack of catalepsy, a seizure so severe she lay helpless for more than 8 months. Her body was paralyzed. She could not move. She could not speak. For 3 years, she remained an invalid. The effects of the paralysis continued until the summer of 1542. Even after that, the symptoms returned intermittently until about 1554. During those years of physical agony, something else happened. She discovered mental prayer. She learned to hold Christ present in her mind. She tried to keep him there. She tried as hard as she could, but her imagination was dull. She had no talent for visualizing divine things. She prayed this way, off and on, for 18 years without feeling that she was getting results. 18 years. She was not the only one who struggled. The convent of the Incarnation in Avila was not what Teresa had imagined. It housed more than 200 nuns. Many had no real vocation. They were there because they had nowhere else to go. The convent encouraged them to leave for long periods to save money on expenses. Inside the walls, the nuns arranged their veils attractively. They wore jewelry. Prestige depended on wealth, not piety. There was a constant stream of visitors, parties that included young men. The parlor was always full of conversation. Teresa spent those years in what she later called a stormy sea. She attended the set times of vocal prayer each day. She went to weekly confession. She did her menial duties. She conversed with visitors in what she would later describe as a pestilential pastime. She could find no joy in God. She could find no pleasure in the world. She was stuck between two realities, belonging fully to neither. On December 24th, 1543, her father died. Don Alonso Sanchez de Cepeda. Teresa attended him in his final illness. She watched him die. She was left without the man who had raised her, without his guidance, without his objection to her choices, but also without his protection. She returned to the convent. The silence continued. From 1543 to 1555, Teresa lived in what witnesses later described as a state divided between the worldly and the divine. To the people around her, she appeared as a distinguished lady, gay and witty. She was charming in conversation. She had admirers. One was a nobleman and priest named Garcia de Toledo. She agonized over her feelings for him. She agonized over everything. But she showed none of this struggle to the world. Inside, she was dying. She later wrote that during this time she could not use her intellect in prayer. Her soul would immediately grow recollected, then fall into quiet or rapture, but she could not control it. She could not make use of her senses. She tried to concentrate. She tried to meditate on the passion of Christ. She tried to follow the methods in the books she had read. Nothing worked. The silence remained, not the silence of peace, the silence of abandonment. In 1554, during Lent, Teresa walked through the convent. She was about to enter the oratory. She saw something that stopped her, an image, a statue of Christ, ecce homo. Behold the man. It showed Jesus covered in wounds, bleeding, suffering. It had been brought in for a special feast day for veneration. Teresa was 38 years old. She had been a nun for nearly 20 years. She had prayed through paralysis, through the death of her father, through countless conversations in the parlor that left her empty. She had tried everything she knew to reach God. And in that moment, seeing the wounded Christ, something broke. She threw herself down in front of the statue. She wept. Not gentle tears, floods of tears. She begged him to give her strength to serve him. She begged him to help her stop offending him. The experience left a mark on her soul that would never fade. Shortly after, someone gave her a copy of the Confessions by St. Augustine. She read it. She saw herself in his words. She saw a man who had lived divided, who had struggled, who had been transformed not by his own effort, but by an act of God. She understood that God was within her. She understood that she had been avoiding the mystical journey to him. She had been running from the very thing she sought. And then the visions began. Between 1555 and 1560, Teresa experienced what she would later try to categorize as 9 distinct states of prayer: trances, visions, raptures, divine locutions, intense experiences of God's presence, supernatural physical phenomena. Witnesses claimed they saw her levitate in the chapel. They saw her caught up in ecstasy for lengthy periods, completely unaware of her surroundings. Her face would change. Her body would rise off the ground. Not everyone believed these experiences came from God. Some of her friends, including Francisco de Salcedo and Gaspar Daza, told her that her supernatural experiences were the work of the devil. This caused her considerable anguish and self-doubt. Even her priestly confessors suggested that her strange notions came from demons, not from heaven. She lived with this accusation. She lived with the possibility that everything she experienced was a deception. In 1555, a Jesuit priest named Francis Borgia heard her confession. He told her that the Spirit of God was working in her. He told her not to resist the ecstatic experiences that came in prayer. This was the first time someone with authority validated what she was experiencing. It gave her permission to stop fighting against the very graces God was giving. But here is what no one tells you about Teresa's story. Here is what gets left out of the inspirational summaries. That moment in 1555 when she saw the statue and wept and experienced her conversion was not the end of the darkness. It was the beginning of understanding it. Teresa would later write in The Interior Castle, completed in 1577 when she was 62 years old, about 7 mansions within the soul, 7 stages of prayer, 7 progressions toward union with God. She wrote it in only 2 months after reluctantly agreeing to the task. She was ill, her health was failing, she prayed for help. She received a vision of a crystal castle inside the human soul, with God dwelling at the center. In the first 3 mansions, the soul strives through human effort and ordinary grace. It seeks to overcome sin. It practices daily prayer. It tries to live an exemplary life. But these are the purgative stages. The soul is still doing the work. In the 4th mansion, everything changes. Here, God increases his role. The soul begins to experience supernatural prayer, the prayer of recollection, the prayer of quiet. It is no longer the soul drawing water from a well with a bucket through great effort. It is the soul placed near a spring where water flows directly in. But even here, the soul transitions back and forth between the natural and the supernatural. It struggles between friendship with God and friendship with the world. Teresa described this state with brutal honesty. The soul is still strongly tempted by worldly matters. It is aware of these temptations and desires the quiet and peace within the spirit, but it cannot always reach them. The mind wanders. The imagination will not concentrate. Distractions flood in. The soul might be joined with God in the center of the castle while the mind suffers in the outer walls, engaged with what Teresa called 1,000 wild and poisonous beasts. She wrote that we should not trouble ourselves over this. We should not give up prayer. The devil's objective is to make us abandon the practice. The soul merits greatly by knowingly resisting these struggles, by persevering even when everything feels empty. In the 5th mansion, the prayer of union occurs. The faculties of the soul are suspended for the first time. All the powers of the soul are asleep to worldly things and awake only to God. But it is brief. It lasts only a short time. While it lasts, the soul is completely possessed by God. When it emerges, the soul knows that she was in God and God was in her. There is no doubt, but then it ends. The soul returns to ordinary consciousness. The memory of union remains, but the experience itself withdraws. In the 6th mansion, the afflictions intensify. The soul has tasted divine union. Now it experiences the absence of that union as an unbearable wound. Teresa described this stage with images of suffering that match anything written by the other great mystic of her time, St. John of the Cross, who would become her collaborator in reforming the Carmelite order. They met in 1567 when John was newly ordained. He was about to leave the Carmelites for a more contemplative order, but Teresa convinced him to stay and help her establish the first monastery of Discalced Carmelite friars at Duruelo in 1568. John of the Cross would write about the dark night of the soul. Teresa lived it. In the sixth mansion, the soul receives both increasing favors and increasing afflictions. There are exterior sufferings, bodily sickness, misrepresentation, backbiting, persecution, undeserved praise, poor spiritual direction. And there are interior sufferings, depression so severe it seems the soul will be crushed, dryness that makes prayer feel impossible, a sense that God has withdrawn completely and will never return. Teresa wrote that the pain is not bodily but spiritual, though the body shares in it. The soul feels a deep wound, a physical ache, a burning longing that cannot be satisfied. It feels betrayed. It asks where God has gone. It cannot understand why, after experiencing such intimacy, it has been left alone in darkness. And then, in some rare cases, the soul enters the seventh mansion, the spiritual marriage, the final union on earth before the beatific vision in heaven. Here the soul remains continually in the center with God. The presence of the Trinity becomes impossible to doubt. The dichotomies of Mary and Martha, the contemplative and the active, become one. There is almost no spiritual dryness or interior disturbance. The soul has no fear of death. It lives like Christ, yielding the fruits of good works, maintaining inner calm in all exterior events, doing all deeds with great love. But even here, Teresa stressed something crucial. These experiences are not given for the sake of enjoyment. They are given so that the soul has strength to serve. The point of mystical union is not to escape the world, but to return to it with the love of God burning inside you so intensely that it transforms everything you touch. If you value this level of research, subscribe and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. We are now more than halfway through the information. Teresa founded her first Reformed convent, St. Joseph's in Avila, on August 24, 1562. She called it the most restful period of her life. From 1562 to 1567, she lived there with a small community of nuns, committed to poverty, silence, and contemplative prayer. They followed the primitive rule of the Carmelites with absolute rigor. No jewelry, no visitors, no leaving the enclosure. They prayed for hours each day. They did manual labor. They ate little. They slept on straw. In 1566, a Franciscan missionary named Alonso Maldonado visited and told Teresa about the millions of souls being lost in the Indies for lack of instruction in the faith. She became determined to establish more convents where nuns could pray for the salvation of souls and for the Church, which was being torn apart by the Protestant Reformation in Northern Europe. In 1567, the Carmelite Father General John Rossi visited Avila and encouraged her to make more foundations. That same year, she made her second foundation at Medina del Campo. By the time of her death in 1582, she had founded 15 Reformed monasteries. She had traveled across Spain in covered wagons over terrible roads. She had negotiated with bishops, town councils, wealthy patrons, and hostile local clergy. She had faced opposition from within her own order. She had endured physical illness that grew progressively worse year by year. And through all of it, she had continued to pray, to write, to guide her spiritual daughters, and to reform an entire religious order. But here's the part of Teresa's story that connects to the title of this script, the part about silence testing faith, the part that matters more than all the visions and ecstasies and foundations combined. There is an account preserved in spiritual writings that at the end of Teresa's 18 years of seeing darkness, before the visions began, Jesus appeared to her. She asked him a question born from nearly 2 decades of trying to pray and feeling nothing, a question that reveals the true nature of spiritual suffering. She asked, "Where have you been all these years?" And Jesus replied, "I was closer to you then than I am now." Read that again. She spent 18 years in spiritual dryness, feeling abandoned, wondering if God existed at all, trying every method of prayer she knew and receiving nothing back. And when he finally appeared to her in a way she could perceive, he told her he had been closest to her during the years when she felt most alone. The silence was not absence. The silence was presence so pure, so beyond her ability to perceive, that it felt like emptiness. The darkness was not punishment. The darkness was God preparing her soul to hold the light that would come later. The years of effort that seemed wasted were the years when the most profound work was being done, in depths of her being she could not see or measure or understand. Teresa later wrote about this in her teaching on the mansions. She explained that in the early stages of prayer, we receive consolations. We feel God's presence. We have moments of sweetness and joy that encourage us to continue. These are gifts for beginners. They are given because the soul needs them to persevere. But as the soul advances, God withdraws these consolations, not because he has abandoned the soul, but because he is calling it to a deeper kind of faith, a faith that does not depend on feeling, a faith that continues when there is nothing to hold on to except the naked trust that God is there even when every sense says otherwise. This is the prayer of quiet. This is the prayer of recollection. This is the beginning of contemplative prayer. It is not a prayer where the mind thinks many thoughts. It is not a prayer where the imagination creates vivid scenes. It is a prayer of silence, of stillness, of waiting in darkness with no assurance except the decision to remain present even when presence itself seems impossible. Teresa wrote in The Interior Castle that when we are in this state, we should make our petitions like beggars before a powerful, rich emperor. We should wait with downcast eyes, humbly. When God secretly shows us he hears our prayers, it is well to be silent, for he has drawn us into his presence. There would be no harm in trying to keep our minds at rest. But if God makes no sign of listening or seeing us, there is no need to stand inert like a dolt. In that case, dryness would greatly increase and the imagination would become more restless than before. At such times, God wishes us to offer him our petitions, to place ourselves in his presence, trusting that he knows what is best for us. This is why Teresa insisted that we should never force the intellect to be still. We should use gentle means to overcome distractions. We should fix our mind and heart on Christ and speak to him in love, sometimes in words, other times with a look of love. Silence is not the goal of prayer. Silence is a means to invite God in. He will come when he wills. We must be content to wait for him. What Teresa discovered through her 18 years of darkness was that the deepest prayer is not a technique. It is not a method we master. It is a relationship. And like any real relationship, it involves times when the other person seems absent, times when we have to trust without proof, times when we continue loving even when we receive no response. The most dangerous temptation in spiritual darkness is to believe that the darkness means we are doing something wrong, that if we just tried harder, prayed better, had more faith, the darkness would lift. Teresa fought this temptation for 18 years. She blamed herself. She thought her spiritual dryness was her fault. She looked at other people who seemed to have vibrant prayer lives and wondered what was wrong with her. And then God showed her the truth. The darkness was not her failure. The darkness was his gift. It was the way he was preparing her for everything that would come after, the visions, the ecstasies, the reforms, the writings that would guide millions of souls over the next 500 years. None of it would have been possible without those 18 years when nothing happened except the slow, invisible, agonizing work of God stripping away everything she thought she knew about prayer so he could teach her something deeper. Teresa's experience connects directly to what would happen to another Teresa 4 centuries later, Mother Teresa of Calcutta, born Agnes Gongsha Boyakshiu in 1810 in Skopje, Macedonia. She entered the Sisters of Loreto in 1928. She was sent to India. In 1946, on September 10th, she experienced what she called her call within a call. She heard the voice of Jesus telling her to leave the convent and serve the poorest of the poor in the slums of Calcutta. She obeyed. She founded the Missionaries of Charity in 1950. She opened homes for the dying, for orphans, for lepers, for those with AIDS. She became one of the most recognizable faces of compassionate service in the 20th century. She received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1979. People saw her smile. They saw her joy. They saw what appeared to be an unshakable faith. But when her private letters were published after her death in Come Be My Light, the world learned something shocking. For more than 50 years after her initial call, Mother Teresa lived in spiritual darkness. She wrote to her spiritual directors about the dryness, the darkness, the loneliness, the torture she was undergoing. She compared the experience to hell. She said at one point that it had driven her to doubt the existence of heaven and even of God. In 1957, she wrote that in the darkness she felt forsaken. In 1958, there was a brief respite. 1 month when the darkness lifted during a Requiem Mass for Pope Pius XII, the Pope who had granted her permission to leave Loreto and go among the poor. For that 1 month, her soul was filled with love, with joy untold, with an unbroken union of love. And then it ended. He is gone again, she wrote, leaving me alone. She lived in this darkness until her death in 1997. In more than 40 communications with her spiritual directors, many never before published, she wrote about her pain. The more I want him, she wrote, the less I am wanted. I want to love him as he has not been loved, and yet there is that separation, that terrible emptiness, that feeling of absence of God. She was acutely aware of the discrepancy between her inner state and her public demeanor. The smile, she wrote, is a mask or cloak that covers everything. She wondered whether she was engaged in verbal deception. I spoke as if my very heart was in love with God. Tender personal love, she wrote to an advisor. If you were there, you would have said, what hypocrisy. The Jesuit priest James Martin, author of My Life with the Saints, said after reading her letters that he had never read a saint's life where the saint had such an intense spiritual darkness. St. John of the Cross and others wrote poems and spiritual canticles to describe their sufferings in God's absence. Mother Teresa never did. Only her spiritual directors knew of her anguish. But here is what her spiritual directors eventually helped her understand. In 1961, Father Joseph Neuner told her that her dark night could have been an invitation from God. Perhaps he had called her to identify with abandonment, the abandonment of the poor she served, the abandonment Christ experienced on the cross, to share in his redemptive suffering. He reminded her that the longing for God came from God himself. He was still present even if it felt like he was not. She responded for the first time in 11 years that she had come to love the darkness. It took her 11 years to reach that point. 11 years of living in darkness before she could say she loved it. Not because the darkness itself was good, but because she finally understood what it meant. It meant she was united to Christ in his abandonment. It meant her life of service was not built on consolations or feelings, but on pure faith. It meant she loved God not for what he gave her, but for who he was. This is what silence tests. Not whether we believe in God when we feel his presence. Anyone can do that. Silence tests whether we believe in God when we feel nothing, whether we continue praying when prayer feels empty, whether we keep serving when service brings no joy, whether we remain faithful when faithfulness costs us everything and seems to gain us nothing. Teresa of Avila's 18 years of darkness prepared her to write The Interior Castle, to reform the Carmelite order, to guide countless souls through their own dark nights. Mother Teresa's 50 years of darkness enabled her to serve the poorest of the poor with a smile that came not from feeling but from will, from the decision to love regardless of cost. Both women discovered the same truth. The silence is not the absence of God. The silence is the presence of God in a form we cannot perceive until we stop trying to perceive it, until we let go of needing proof, until we accept that faith means trusting in darkness. Teresa of Avila wrote that God alone is enough, not God plus consolations, not God plus visions, not God plus the feeling that we are making progress. Just God. God in the darkness, God in the silence, God in the 18 years when nothing seemed to happen, God closer to us in the emptiness than in the ecstasy. On October 4th, 1582, Teresa died in Alba de Tormes in Salamanca. Her last words were reported to be about the church. She was 67 years old. She had lived 47 years as a Carmelite nun. She had founded 17 convents. She had written 4 major works on prayer and mysticism. She had reformed an entire religious order. And she had done all of it, starting from 18 years when the only thing she learned was how to wait in silence for a God who never seemed to come. She was canonized 40 years later in 1622 by Pope Gregory XV. In 1970, Pope Paul VI declared her a doctor of the Church, the first woman to receive that title. Her writings on prayer, especially The Interior Castle, remain some of the most profound guides to the spiritual life ever written. Not because they promise easy answers or quick results, because they tell the truth about what the journey actually requires. The monastery where Teresa was born still stands in Avila. The convent of the male branch of Discalced Carmelites preserves the house. Inside the monastery of the Incarnation, where she spent those 18 years, they have kept her cell, the parlor where she conversed with visitors, the refectory, the stairs, the choir loft, the garden, all exactly as they were in her time. There is a museum with relics, the image of Ecce Homo, the statue of the wounded Christ that broke her heart in 1555. Visitors can stand where she stood. They can look at the image she saw. They can imagine the tears she wept. But the real relic is not in any museum. The real relic is the testimony of what those 18 years of silence produced. Not visions, not miracles, not even the reforms or the writings. What those 18 years produced was a woman who understood that God's presence does not depend on our ability to feel it, that faith does not require proof, that love continues in darkness, that the most profound union with God often happens when we are most certain he has abandoned us. In the 6th mansion of the Interior Castle, Teresa wrote about a soul who has tasted union with God and now experiences his absence as unbearable. She wrote that this soul should remember that the Lord never said following him would be easy, but that it would be worth it. She wrote that we should not seek him in dark corners. We should seek him in ourselves, where he dwells, always, even when we cannot sense him, especially when we cannot sense him. The spiritual directors of both Teresa of Avila and Mother Teresa of Calcutta recognized something that the women themselves struggled to see for years. The darkness was not a sign of God's absence. The darkness was a sign of his most intimate presence. It was the stripping away of everything that was not pure faith. Everything that depended on feeling or consolation or visible progress. Everything except the naked trust that God is who he says he is and will do what he has promised, regardless of what we experience or do not experience in prayer. This understanding changes everything about how we read their lives. The 18 years Teresa of Avila spent feeling abandoned were not wasted time. They were not years when nothing happened. They were the years when the foundation was being laid for everything that came after. Every moment of dryness was building the capacity to hold the visions without being destroyed by them. Every moment of emptiness was teaching her to depend not on experience, but on God himself. The 50 years Mother Teresa spent in darkness were not a contradiction of her ministry. They were the source of it. Because she knew what it felt like to be abandoned, She could serve the abandoned without needing them to make her feel good about it. Because she continued loving God when she could not feel his love, she could continue loving the dying and the poor when they could give her nothing back. Her darkness made her free. Free from needing consolation, free to serve for love alone. In the final account, both women discovered that silence does not test whether we love God. Silence tests how we love God. Whether we love him for what he gives us or for who he is, whether we serve him to feel his presence or because he is worthy of service regardless of what we feel, whether our faith depends on experience or on something deeper than experience can reach. The statue that Teresa saw in 1555, the wounded Christ, the Ecce Homo, is still preserved in a museum in Avila. It stands as a testament to the moment when 18 years of darkness broke open into light. But that breaking was not magic. It was not God randomly deciding to end her suffering. It was Teresa finally understanding what the suffering had been teaching her all along. She saw Christ wounded. She saw him abandoned. She saw him carrying the weight of the world's sin with no consolation except obedience to the Father. And she understood that her 18 years of praying in darkness had been preparing her to follow him not in glory, but in his passion. Not in the resurrection, but in Good Friday. Not in the feeling of God's presence, but in the faith that holds when presence seems impossible. This is what gets carved into the soul during spiritual darkness. Not theological knowledge, not mystical experiences, not even virtue in the ordinary sense. What gets carved is the capacity to continue when there is no reason to continue except God. The willingness to love when love brings no return. The determination to pray when prayer feels like talking to an empty room. The faith that persists when every feeling contradicts it. Both Teresas lived lives that proved you do not need consolations to be a saint. You do not need visions to be faithful. You do not need to feel God's presence to serve him effectively. What you need is the willingness to endure the silence, to keep praying, to keep loving, to keep serving, to keep believing not because you feel anything, but because you have decided that God is enough even when he gives you nothing but himself in darkness. In 1647, the sculptor Gian Lorenzo Bernini created his masterpiece, The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, in the church of Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome. It shows Teresa in the moment of her transverberation when an angel allegedly pierced her heart with a flaming arrow in 1560. It is one of the most famous sculptures in the world, dramatic, sensual, overwhelming in its depiction of spiritual ecstasy. But that sculpture shows the moment that came after 18 years of nothing. It shows the experience that was only possible because of the preparation that happened in silence. It shows the flower, not the root. The fruit, not the seed. The manifestation, not the foundation. The real story of Teresa is not the ecstasy. The real story is the 18 years before it. The years when she kept praying even though prayer felt pointless. The years when she kept seeking God even though he seemed to have abandoned her. The years when the only thing she had to hold on to was the decision she had made at 20 years old to enter the convent, and the stubborn refusal to give up on that decision no matter how empty it felt. Those 18 years are the story, because those are the years most people live in. Those are the years when faith actually gets tested. Those are the years when we discover whether we love God or whether we love the experience of God, whether we serve him or whether we serve the feeling of serving him, whether we trust him or whether we trust our ability to perceive him. In the records of the Discalced Carmelites, preserved in their archives, there are letters and testimonies from nuns who knew Teresa personally. They describe her patience with those who struggled in prayer, her gentleness with those who felt abandoned by God, her insistence that dryness is not a sign of failure but often a sign of God's deepest work. They describe how she would tell her spiritual daughters not to be troubled by distractions, not to think they had wasted their time in prayer when they could not concentrate, not to believe the devil's lie that they should give up. She knew these temptations intimately. She had lived them for 18 years, and when she finally understood what they meant, she spent the rest of her life helping others understand the same truth. The silence is not punishment. The silence is preparation. The darkness is not God's absence. The darkness is his presence in a form that transforms us at depths we cannot reach through consolation. In 1577, when Teresa wrote The Interior Castle, she was 62 years old. Her health was declining rapidly. She had chronic headaches, digestive problems, weakness that made even writing difficult. She completed the book in 2 months. When asked how she managed it, she said she prayed for help and God spoke through her. She received the vision of the Crystal Castle with 7 mansions. She wrote down what she saw. But what enabled her to see it was not the vision itself. What enabled her to see it was the 18 years of darkness that had taught her to recognize the landscape of the soul, the stages of prayer, the progressive stripping away of everything that is not God, the long journey through dryness and consolation, through effort and grace, through the agony of God's apparent absence and the terror of his manifest presence. She could map the interior castle because she had traveled through every room of it herself, and at the center of that castle, in The Seventh Mansion Where God Dwells, Teresa describes something that connects directly to the question she asked Jesus when he finally appeared to her after 18 years. She described a state where the soul remains continually in the center with God, where the presence of the Trinity is impossible to doubt, where there is almost no spiritual dryness or interior disturbance. But even there, she insisted, even in the highest union possible on earth, the soul must still live in the world, must still serve, must still do ordinary things with extraordinary love. The point of the mystical journey is not escape. The point is transformation that enables return. Return to the world with the love of God burning so intensely inside you that it changes everything you touch. Return to ordinary life with the certainty that God is present even when he cannot be felt. Return to service that requires no consolation because it springs from love alone. This is why both Teresas, separated by 4 centuries, matter to anyone who has ever felt abandoned by God in prayer. Because they prove that the abandonment is not the end of the story, it is the middle of it. It is the part where the real work happens, the part that prepares you for everything God intends to do through you. And they prove that you can serve God effectively while feeling nothing. You can love him deeply while doubting his presence. You can build movements that change the world while living in interior darkness. Because what matters is not what you feel. What matters is what you choose, who you love, how you continue, whether you give up or whether you keep praying into the silence until the silence itself becomes prayer. At the Carmelite monastery in Alba de Tormes, where Teresa died, her body was exhumed 9 months after burial in 1583. It was found incorrupt. Over the following years, various parts were distributed as relics to churches and monasteries across Spain and beyond. Her heart is preserved in a special reliquary in Alba de Tormes. Her left hand is in Avila. Her right foot is in Rome. Her bones scattered across Europe. But the real relic is not her body. The real relic is what she left in writing. The testimony that 18 years of feeling nothing taught her more about God than all the visions that came after. That silence tested her faith more deeply than any persecution could have. That darkness prepared her soul to hold light in a way that consolation never could, and that God was closest to her precisely when she was most certain he had gone.